Hi there, my name is Philip Ideson. I want to welcome you to the Art of Procurement podcast, the podcast that helps you, a forward-thinking procurement professional, position yourself and your team to proactively take advantage of the revolution that's taking place in procurement today. By interviewing industry trailblazers and sharing insights from our own experiences, my team and I pull back the curtain and shine a light on the strategies, tactics, and tools that procurement teams are using to elevate their impact. And in today's episode, I'd like to share with you a recent conversation from an AOP Live webinar with Jared Ridgley, the head of sales for the US at IntegrityNext, and Alexander Hellwig, the editor of sustainability and compliance, also of IntegrityNext. And in this webinar, we discussed tips for procurement teams in their 2024 ESG planning process. So we covered a lot of topics, such as the perceptions and misconceptions around ESG and what ESG really means today. We talked about some of the most important ESG topics that everyone should be aware of going into 2024, and how to leverage emerging technology to build supply chain transparency and integrate ESG into every facet of the business. Now, I started by asking Jared the question that I always ask to kick things off, and that was if he found procurement or if procurement found him.
So interestingly enough, I would say in my career, procurement has found me twice. So it's not something that I studied. I studied information systems. I went into this, full-heartedly thinking I was going to do, whatever with this, and then found myself working for the procurement department at ABB, doing internal implementations of procurement systems. So squarely within what I studied, but within the procurement space. Somewhere along the way, I moved out of this and moved more to a revenue operations side of things until IntegrityNext came around and knocked on my door and pulled me back into the procurement world.
You couldn't get away. You couldn't get away for too long anyway.
That's right.
Alex, how about you?
Well, for me, it's a bit of both, I would say. I previously worked for a sustainability rating agency as an analyst. And there, my job was really to assess the sustainability performance of companies. And the main focus was on the company's own operations, though. And procurement and supply chains did not feature very strongly in the methodology, despite the outsized impact that the supply chains obviously have in many industries. So for me, it was just almost a natural transition to move on to a company that focuses exactly on that and that really aims to, tackle the topic of sustainability in supply chains and in procurement.
Which is interesting, given as you say, the outsized impact that the supply chain has on any companies, given that from a services perspective, it may be 20% of your spend, 20% of your revenue, is with external partners, but in manufacturing that could be 70%, 80% out with suppliers as opposed to just looking inside. So hopefully that's changing, and hopefully we'll dig into that a little bit in the conversation. But what I also wanted to follow up, and I'll ask this, Alex, to you first, is we talk about ESG all the time, and it's one of those things that it can be a really incredibly broad topic. There's lots of definitions. We'll be talking about some of those definitions. There's lots of acronyms. What ESG is may differ from company, from industry, but also from geography. So just kind of to level set where we all are today, I wonder if you could share a little bit on what your perspective is on what we mean when we talk about ESG.
Yeah, thanks, Philip. As you just said, there's obviously lots of different meanings and interpretations of what ESG or sustainability really stands for. So I think what's really critical for me is that, there's two dimensions that you should always keep in mind. And first of all, that would be the time horizon. So any ESG strategy really needs to take a long-term perspective and really think about resilience and adaptability in the long run. Short-term thinking really is the enemy of ESG and sustainability, I would say. And the second dimension is systems thinking. So I think it's really vital to be mindful of the bigger picture and interdependencies that exist between different parts of a system. I mean, today we know that in nature everything is connected, and that really also holds true for most processes at the corporate level or the economy at large. And it's just so critical to keep in mind all the different facets that may affect you as a company, but that also may have and your operations that may have an impact on the world around you. So integrated approaches and holistic approaches should really be at the core of ESG, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm. And that's interesting because from a procurement perspective, where we are the connector. If procurement and supply chain done well, we are the connector within the organization, because there are rarely areas of the business that get to see so many other different kind of components and everything, how it all comes together. That often makes our job harder, because we've got to drive change across more stakeholders, as opposed to it being something that's a little bit perhaps more siloed. But it's interesting, you kind of explaining that as being everything's so connected, which is, I think, a positive for us as procurement and supply chain professionals in the impact that we can have. But Jared, anything to add or additional thoughts on, what ESG is either to you, or what perhaps you see some misconceptions when you're talking to folks about what they think ESG is?
Sure. So I see ESG is historically it's been about, primarily anyways, regulations, right? So, regulations are driving, we must do this. Unfortunately, we're going to get punished if we do not do this. And I think this is still a large driver today, especially pushing into these additional areas that we see across the three different pillars. But there's another aspect that I see coming into play even more heavily, which we have seen in play previously, but not as heavily, which is other external pressures. So customers putting pressure on us, right? Investors, lenders taking into consideration how sustainable a business is and affecting rates based upon this.
Yeah.
So there are a lot of outside factors that are coming into play in the ESG world, getting money cheaper, protecting our brand, as well as complying with more and more stringent regulations.
Mm-hmm. The business case has never been so clear.
100%.
That's true.
So let's, if we can pop up the slide, Brittany, we do a poll before each one of our AOP lives of the AOP community. And I want to just share this with you, just to get your opinions on how the community responded. And I'm going to read this out as well for anybody who may be listening to this conversation afterwards rather than watching. The question that we asked the AOP community was, which of the following ESG related activities is the highest priority for your procurement team? And so in order of responses, by far and away, the largest priority was translating visions into action, with 55% of the vote. Now, in second was absorbing regulatory changes at 24% of the vote. Third was the selling of decision makers at 14%. And then reporting on results of sustainability activities was in fourth place at 7%. Alex, if I come to you first, what were your kind of perspectives on the poll that we took, and does this translate into what you see on a day-to-day basis?
Well, actually, yeah, when I saw the results, I was partly surprised, and then to a certain extent, not so much after all. So it's, if we look at the first figure here, translating visions into action, I think that's what's to be expected. It's fairly easy to formulate a vision, to formulate goals, and to say where you want to be in X amount of years. But actually translating theory into practice, that is the big challenge. So companies really need to set up entirely new processes and structures in their businesses, really gain a lot more insight in terms of data that they need. So transparency is really a very critical issue. And all of this really takes time, setting up all these systems and processes. And Yeah, the one thing that really surprised me a little bit here was the fourth result,
Right.
reporting on the results, so that many companies do not consider that to be a high priority. Because there's so much legislation these days. I mean, when we look at Europe particularly, but also in the US, the SEC has been working on its climate-related disclosure standards for a while now. Then in California, a law was passed on climate-related disclosures a short while ago. And there's just so much happening in the space. And what we always hear from companies is that we just don't have the data. We're lacking the insights. So how are we supposed to report on these issues? So that's the one thing that surprised me a little bit here.
Interesting. It could be that a lot of the respondents have not even got to the organizational maturity around ESG reporting to even think about the results, because they're still thinking about, okay, I understand it, but I don't necessarily know what to do about it. So it's kind of that's once that realization occurs, then it's okay, how do I actually report what I'm working on? Because right now I don't know what to work on. Jared, any thoughts that you had taking a look at this?
So to me, there's nothing really surprising here. So I definitely see translating vision into action is clearly the biggest hurdle to overcome, right? So it's a new topic to many companies. It's a new topic to many people within these companies. Therefore, we see a rise in new roles such as, sustainability officers, et cetera. So there's a real focus on, how do we do this? We know we need to do something now. We feel we need to do something now, but how do we actually do it? So that is not surprising to me at all. The second one, I think, is a valid concern as well, right? As mentioned, we live in a constantly changing environment, and keeping up with this can seem like a daunting task, especially doing this in-house with various regulations popping up around the world. It can be extremely challenging. So again, not surprising to me. Selling decision makers, also a good one, right? So when you don't have the right people in place and it's a bottom-up driven imperative, it can be extremely difficult. You're fighting with the sales department for budget. You're fighting with everyone else for budget. So again, unsurprising to me. And I will take the last point, 7% for reporting on results, as an artifact of perhaps there's an expectation that if we solve the first points, that is a given that we will have a reporting output.
No, I tend to agree on that in terms of we haven't even got to that point of thinking about the results, as we're still trying to figure out what should we do with the vision that we have and turn that into action. But let's move on to talking about something I mentioned in the intro was, a roundtable that I had where I was talking to procurement leaders around, how do you engage more closely with the CEO of your organization? And ESG initiatives was something that came out of that. So Jared, what would you say is the current business perspective of the organizations that you talk to on where they are seeing ESG initiatives?
Yeah, I think it varies, of course, based on the industry, based on the geography, but it is becoming clearly a much more pressing topic across the board here. So due to a variety of reasons, including new regulations, as mentioned, customer pressure, other outside pressures, investors, lenders, et cetera. But there's clearly a feeling in the air that more needs to be done. This is without a doubt. I see this, coming into our business and into the general business landscape.
You feel that there's a feeling that the CEOs believe more needs to be done, or just generally there needs to be more done to prioritize amongst CEOs?
Generally, but it's feeding into the CROs, hence the hiring of these new positions like a chief sustainability officer, right? A chief diversity officer, and. So positions that we have historically not even heard of. Yeah.
Do you find that ESG initiatives compete with other business objectives? There's this the consideration of, well, it's this or something else, as opposed to it being an and.
I think when there's a misunderstanding, there is, or when there's a lack of clear understanding at the very top, that's where the competition comes in. So if there's an understanding from the top down, I think friction is removed clearly.
Yeah.
But again, if it's a bottom-up driven initiative, then absolutely you're fighting until you convince the right people that this is something we have to do, not something that's nice to do anymore.
Mm-hmm. And Alex, how large of a role do regulations play? We've talked a little bit about regulations. We talked about them in the poll results. Are regulations still the driving force?
Oh, definitely. I mean, I believe they're probably the key driver of ESG in many parts of the world. And we shouldn't forget that many of these ESG-related regulations have also been introduced in response to widespread malpractice. So human rights, labor rights, and environmental violations that have occurred within companies' own operations, but obviously largely and increasingly so in supply chains. And I would even say that many, if not most of our customers, they really cite national regulations such as the German Supply Chain Due Diligence Act or the French Supply Chain Act or the Norwegian Transparency Act as the main reasons to approach us, because they really need help in setting up the systems, risk management systems, processes, and data collection procedures in order to be able to tackle all of these legal provisions.
Do you feel like there needs to be, or there will ultimately be, a tipping point where there's enough individual country regulations where those regulations become standard practice, if you will? Like it's easier for an organization to comply across their entire global operations because of certain in-country regulations, as opposed to just looking at this on a country-by-country basis.
Is that a question for me mainly, or?
Yeah, Alex. Yeah, I'm interested, like, as a follow-up to the regulatory, where we are from a regulation perspective.
Yeah, I think a country-by-country approach can be very risky because it's very easy to lose track of all the bits and pieces that you may have to consider on a national level. So my hope is that we're moving to a more harmonized approach globally, and that is also something that we're seeing when we look at the most recent regulatory developments. So in terms of ESG related disclosures, for instance, the ISSB has already developed 2 standards, ESG related disclosure standards, which will most likely be adopted by many jurisdictions around the world, even developing countries. And then many of the regulations that are in the works, for instance, at the European level, such as the forced labor regulation or deforestation regulation and the carbon border adjustment mechanism, all of these will have global implications. So many of these topics, they will no longer be confined to single regions, single countries, but they will really apply globally.
And so, as one last follow-up, Alex and Jared, feel free to jump in as well on this one. We're thinking and we're talking about ESG as and the components of ESG, which we're going to talk about in a moment, as an initiative on its own. But to what extent should we actually just be integrating the best practices around ESG into business as usual? Into standard sourcing, into standard supply management frameworks, for example, from bringing it back to procurement, versus talking about ESG as something that is, is a box that's over here, and and everything else is kind of over here, if you understand what I mean.
Yeah, I think to me it is very clear that it should not be a standalone priority. It should really be integrated as much as possible into existing processes, structures, and policies. because there's so many synergistic effects to be gained. And this also goes hand in hand with what I said earlier in terms of system thinking. ESG is such a cross-cutting issue that it affects many, if not most, parts of a business. And if we just think about, if an engineer wants to design a new product, he or she may have very particular requirements for that product, which may, however, differ very much from what a person in procurement has in mind in terms of sustainability. So it's just really important that these two departments talk to each other, and not only these two, a range of others as well: sales, HR, legal department, sustainability. So ESG cannot be a standalone issue, and that is also reflected in many regulations, really, because when we look at the OECD due diligence guidance for responsible business conduct, for instance, which is a widely used framework, it really attaches a lot of importance to this integrated nature of ESG, because it also asks companies to integrate ESG into their systems and processes. And that's precisely also what the upcoming European Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive is asking for. So we're seeing it everywhere.
Yeah. And Jared, are you seeing this in the companies that you're talking to, that they are starting to integrate ESG elements into just business as usual, standard business practice, as opposed to looking at it as something that's a little more siloed?
100%. So oftentimes we see perhaps the systems will start out as silos, right? Just to get the ESG aspect up and running as quickly as possible, and then look to integrate that, and bidirectional integration as well, by the way, right? So taking a supplier from the vendor master, automatically sending it across, automatically kicking off a process in the ESG platform, and then pushing this data to the system where users are already spending their day-to-day, right? So put it into place where they can make informed decisions using this data, running through a tendering process. Let's shove some suppliers through during the tendering process so we can decide, is there anything uncomfortable we need to discuss or take into consideration before we get into this legal relationship? As Alex said, flipping it completely to the other side of the business. What do we do when a customer is asking for us for a report as to what we're doing, because it's required for their business as well, right? We need to easily be able to generate some information, a report, hand this over, and clearly communicate, hey, look, we are doing what we say we're doing. We're not just saying we're doing it.
Now, I want to go into the E, the S, and the G. And Alex, I'm going to start with you. So let's talk about the E, the environmental element of ESG. What are some of the top environmental topics and challenges that procurement and supply chain teams should be prepared to address as we start to look forward to 2024?
Well, I mean, the carbon footprint is obviously still up there. It almost seems like it's old hat because it's been around for so long. But companies are still struggling a lot with emissions accounting and determining sufficiently accurate Scope 3 emissions, for instance. So it is a topic that will remain for some time to come. There's no doubt about that. But in terms of, let's say, new topics are coming up, I'm definitely seeing biodiversity and ecosystem conservation as one big priority. So last December, the Convention on Biological Diversity adopted the Global Biodiversity Framework, which supports the achievement of the SDGs on the one hand, but on the other hand, it really sets out a pathway to protect nature. And it's, to me, I mean, this is just my personal belief, the biodiversity crisis is even more severe than the climate crisis, because many companies are not only unaware of the impacts they have on the environment, but more importantly, they're even less aware of how dependent they are on nature.
Yeah.
And that is something that really so far has not been on the radar of many companies. And that's why I think it's interesting that very recently some of you may have heard of the TNFD, which is the Task Force on Nature-related Financial Disclosures, which is the same for nature as the TCFD is for climate, and that has been around for quite a few years. And this initiative recently published a risk management and disclosure framework for companies to act on nature-related dependencies, impacts, risks, and opportunities. And it directly relates to the global biodiversity framework that I mentioned about earlier. So I'm clearly seeing this as one of the top priorities going into 2024. And I think the other topic would probably be the circular economy, which obviously has so many different facets when we look at it in more detail. The EU is working on its, or is currently updating its circular economy action plan, and that has just so many different dimensions, addressing sustainable packaging, the reuse of product components, recycling, repair services, use of non-hazardous substances. All of that really forms part of this one big overarching topic of the circular economy. So these would be my top priorities.
Interesting. So a new thing, if for anybody who's focused mostly on, as you said before, the carbon footprint, interesting to start seeing what else is coming down that we should be thinking about. So it's not just, focus on one thing in isolation without necessarily, as you talked about before, everything is connected at the end of the day. And while some of these other areas may not be at the front of mind, it's around being aware of them so you can start thinking when you're making decisions about one, that you're not having unintended consequences based on some of the others that you ultimately have to, even if you don't today, be monitoring, measuring, and making impact on.
Yeah, exactly. And there's just so many overlaps between all of these topics. And just to give you one very brief example, the circular economy is a lot about reducing resource extraction. So the more we can reduce the extraction of natural resources, the more we can also, or the more easily we can reduce our emissions, the more we can mitigate impacts on the environment and biodiversity. So all of it is connected.
So, Jared, let's talk about the S, so social. We hear that Europe is more ahead on the E, the environmental, while the US is more focused on the S, the social. We were just talking actually before we went live around you've lived and worked in many different countries around the world over the last 10, 15 years or so. So you've got a really good perspective around the world. Is that still your experience? Europe more focused on environmental, the US more focused on social?
I think historically this has been the case. I think we are at the moment where this is changing and broadening in general. So, the social side has been important because, there's been a lot of pressure from we as human customers, wanting to feel good about the products that we're buying, right? I don't want to buy a shirt that was made by slave labor or child labor, right? It makes me feel not so good as a human being. So I think there has been a lot of pressures on companies from customers themselves in this area. When we come to the E aspect, outside the customer carbon pressure, and let's exclude a few industries, right? Because E has always been important when it's high-tech electronics manufacturing, substances of concern, conflict minerals, etc., which actually falls under the social aspect as well. But I do see that this is becoming much more important. So as Alex mentioned, we have these upcoming climate regulations coming in the United States. We have, going beyond decarbonization, right? Currently, the standard is corporate carbon accounting, which is fairly inaccurate when we get down to the nuts and bolts of it, right? So entering into newer, deeper topics like product carbon footprint, which gets into what Alex said about the circular economy and what's the carbon footprint of a particular widget over the entire life cycle of that widget, and getting down to extremely accurate carbon accounting, which again moves into these other areas of circular economy and what do we do with these things afterwards, and removing some of these substances of concern, etc. Water waste, waste in general, deforestation. I think all of these are also becoming much larger and pressing topics, not only here in the United States, but globally.
Yeah, it's definitely interesting to see while a lot of around the environmental, for example, started in, well, not necessarily started, but there was more prevalence and more initiative driven out of Europe that is now coming into the US, as both from a regulatory perspective, but also customer and brand reputation perspective. Now, Alex, from a social perspective, we always think about supply diversity when we think about the social, but what other elements or activities could fall under the S that anyone listening today really needs to be aware of?
Well, the priorities obviously vary a lot from one country to another, also from one industry to another. Supply diversity, for instance, has traditionally been a very important topic in the US, whereas in most of Europe, it's been fairly negligible as a topic. Yeah. So that's really something we need to keep in mind. And human and labor rights obviously continue to be highly relevant topics also for operations in industrialized countries. I mean, we've recently seen reports of companies that make use of child labor in the United States. Mm-hmm. So we are far from having solved these issues, and they will continue to be important. But I think another topic that's also increasingly in the spotlight is health hazards arising from environmental pollution and industrial processes. So the effects of corporate actions on community well-being, that I think is a big priority, or should be a priority for companies. PFAS or PFAS chemicals, per and polyfluoroalkyl substances. Sorry, I had to look that up. They have been awareness of these substances has been increasing tremendously over the past few years, and there's more and more news reports about these hazardous substances, and I think this is only the start of it, really. So awareness is constantly increasing, and also not only of the industrial processes, but also of all the harm that they can cause to people. So from a social perspective, I think that's an important one.
And it again shows how connected and tied together all this is. I think about when you were talking about health hazards, the wildfires across Canada and that have then brought the smoke into and above major cities that are actually impacting business. Both an environmental hazard and a climate issue, but that is then having an impact on the social, on the S as well.
Absolutely.
And one of the things I just want to mention when you were talking at the beginning about modern slavery, I think it's just important to note that I think that in the US and the UK, in Europe as well, we often look at modern slavery as being, well, that's an issue when you're using manufacturing in, in countries that may not have the same regulatory environment or, supply chain rigor or whatever it is. So important to mention. And now we're seeing things coming in the news. It's everywhere. It's in the US, it's in Europe, it's in, all around the world. It's not just something we look at as a supply chain of a so-called low-cost country. And we've done a lot of work with Adata Procurement in trying to encourage folks to think about that. It's, we need to be aware of it, how modern slavery and the risks of modern slavery are embedded in supply chains around the world.
Absolutely, yeah.
Now let's get to the G and the governance, and we actually talk a lot less about the G, I think, Alex, but that could be the most important because that's the way that it ties everything together. How should procurement think about governance related to the environmental and the social issues?
Well, I think the first thing that comes to mind really when I think about governance is really how decisions are made in a company and who has the power to make these decisions. And as I've said before, supply chain sustainability is one of those cross-cutting topics. And to start with, it is something that should be led from the top. I mean, there's really the need for executive buy-in and support. Otherwise, it simply won't work. And that's why I was glad to see the results of that survey earlier. And because I think executive buy-in was not exactly considered to be a huge problem. Right. And then, yeah, like I just said, it's a cross-cutting topic. So it affects all or most parts of a business. And that's why it's really important to involve all the relevant parties and departments in decision making. You also need to empower them to make decisions and make sure that they all pull in the same direction so that one department does not work against another one. And it's critical to make sure that they pursue the same goals, or at least converging goals, let's say, because the priorities in terms of costs and budget and so on, they can differ significantly from one department to another. And that's why cross-departmental working groups can, for instance, be a good way of addressing this.
Who, in your experience, owns the governance within an organization? Or does that differ where you have, a chief sustainability officer and where you don't have somebody who's taking overall control? Like, what do you typically see?
Yeah, it's a difficult one because business models vary significantly. So, and yeah, governance systems probably work very differently in big companies as compared to small ones, and it depends a lot on the hierarchy, whether a company has flat hierarchies or not, whether employees are empowered to make their own decisions, to get involved. So I find it a bit hard to come up with a generic answer here. I don't know, Jared, if you have any input on this.
I would say, yeah. So I've seen this a few times, right? And I would say that if there is another newish title involved, chief compliance officer, this will usually fall under there. And this is where it can get a little bit tricky, right? Where we have a chief compliance officer expecting an ESG tool to do everything from a third-party risk management standpoint. And I think it takes some convincing often that perhaps there's room for two systems here, right? So a real third-party risk management system, which is looking at a much broader governance aspect, and then portions that relate to environmental sustainability and governance from a supply chain, due diligence, regulation standpoint.
Is there Jared? Sorry, go ahead, Alex.
No, sorry, I didn't want to interrupt you. Go ahead.
No, I was going to follow up and ask Jared if there isn't a governance layer that exists within your organization, is that a role that procurement and supply chain professionals and leaders would step up to fill or to coordinate, at least, and kind of an area where we can bring additional value to the business?
I think there's a real opportunity for this. So as the procurement department gets into the topic and starts to understand some of these requirements, and therefore the broader requirements across the business for compliance, I think it is an opportunity for somebody within the procurement department to step up and fill one of these voids, and then look at a much larger picture across an organization.
Mm-hmm. I want to talk about challenges a little bit. And Jared, you're talking to procurement leaders, supply chain leaders every day. What would you say are some of the biggest challenges that they struggle with in terms of ESG? What are the pain points, that your customers are coming to you that they're looking to solve?
I hear a variety of things. First of all, hey, we know we need to do something. We need to report on January 1st, 2024, or March 31st, 2024. Whatever it is, we know we have to do something. We don't know where to begin. There's a ton of tools out there that say they can do a ton of things. Now we need to find the one that fits our organization. And as we discussed earlier, does it fit into my technology stack? Being overwhelmed by all of this as well, right? It's a lot coming at once, especially when there's this regulatory pressure behind it, that it's a lot of weight on the shoulders potentially. Understanding not only the current set of regulations, the pressing immediate action required, but also the upcoming regulations, right? We're not in a static environment. We're in a ever evolving environment, and this is a challenge in itself. Of course, the specific reporting requirements for the various regulations. Do I fall under this regulation? What are my reporting requirements there? Differ from my reporting requirements where I fall under this particular regulation. And then lastly, of course, if it's not a top-down driven process, then we need to look at finding the budget and convincing the higher ups that this is not a nice to do, this is a must do.
Where do you find that? I can understand when it's top down, that there is when it's top down, there's a corporate kind of direction and a strategy around how to address the components of ESG. But when it's bottom up, where do you find that the procurement teams that you're working with are actually going to find out all this information? And I'm not saying they're probably going places and being as confused as they are finding out what to go and do about it. But what are sources of information for procurement folks to learn about what they need to know? Because I'm sure most of them will say, I don't know what I don't know.
They get out there and they start kicking tires from what I've seen. So starting to talk to companies like IntegrityNext, like some others in our space, and understanding what are the capabilities? What do I need to pay attention to? What are the various reporting requirements? How can you support me in these areas? What support do you provide when we're looking towards the future? I think this is where primarily they learn about these things, and then they can take this internally and articulate it up and really bring home the point that, look, guys, this is not a fun to do activities anymore. This is if we don't do this, we are going to be financially penalized.
Yeah. Now, one of the things that I've heard, Jared, is that, and this is at the roundtable that I went to a couple of weeks ago, a procurement leader talking about the sustainability requirements they now have on their suppliers in terms of reporting and business processes are actually pretty onerous. And that's not a bad thing. They're requiring a lot more from their suppliers. But actually, that may take away from the social, because smaller suppliers, and by their virtue, most diverse suppliers are smaller than some of these big corporates, then don't have the capabilities to support on a sustainability front. Are you seeing that there's kind of this conflict between the requirements on sustainability and then that actually impacting the ability to use smaller suppliers?
It's an interesting one. So definitely there is this concern, right? Not every supplier can afford a particular platform. Not every supplier has the time in the world to go out and fill a form that takes weeks or months, must be maintained, etc. there's definitely this concern, and I think this is where a technology choice can support smaller suppliers, right, by the various models that are out there. I think the other side of this I have seen recently, so speaking to a prospect, is they have a focus on incorporating more, so they call this diversity, incorporating more small to medium businesses into their supply chains. So that's a top-down initiative that, doesn't matter diversity, not in the traditional sense that we're used to here in the United States, but diversify our supply base, not using just giant behemoths that can afford any certificate in the world, that can, have all the manpower to fill in forms for weeks and weeks and weeks, no problems, but really incorporating in smaller, medium businesses to diversify, to empower these businesses as well, and have the ability to include them in these regulatory processes.
Yeah. Alex, is there any advice that we can share with small businesses that we want to bring on board on how they can still make progress around sustainability and sustainability goals when they may not have the budgets to go and, hire somebody internally specific to be responsible for it, or fill out the pages and pages and pages and pages of forms that might be required, or change their business processes?
It definitely is a predicament. It is a huge challenge for small businesses. There's no doubt about that. I think, first of all, they should really keep an eye out for tools and, let's say, capacity building measures that are already out there. So when we think about the European corporate sustainability reporting directive, for instance, they are developing more or less stringent reporting standards for SMEs. So to closely monitor those developments. And many authorities and regulators, they also make available tools, training manuals, and so on to help businesses. The other thing is obviously technology, as Jared just mentioned, because in my experience, there's still many companies out there, when we look at carbon accounting, for instance, that use Excel spreadsheets and fill them out manually, and that is just highly inefficient, very cumbersome, time-consuming. So technology really can make a difference here and make lives a lot easier for these companies. And I think smaller companies can also join forces. They could really, establish working groups, bundle their resources, collaborate, exchange their experiences and expertise. Also join industry associations, because trade organizations or industry associations, they often provide their members with trainings, capacity building, and tools. That is also something they could do. And lastly, I would say, because it is often their customers that pass on the pressure to them, I would also say, well, go talk to your customers and make sure they also support you in those efforts. Ask for additional resources, ask for additional training, and so on, because this is, it's not a one-way street. Yeah, it's not like the big businesses should be able to pass on all of the pressure to the smaller ones, because that's just not realistic. It's not going to work. So again, it's really all about collaboration.
Yeah, and oftentimes in supply development, it's it's on us as larger companies, and I say that having worked in a number of larger companies, to help nurture some of the smaller organizations that we might want to work with and give them that support, as opposed to just saying, this is our requirements, and if you can't meet it, we can't work with you. Like, what can we do proactively to be a source of consultative help, or a connector? Because those ultimately everyone's going to benefit from, and you will probably end up needing to do that to be able to meet both your social, your supply diversity, and your environmental sustainability goals. I know we've got a few minutes left, and you talked there about, Alex, a little bit about technology. I want to just segue to technology. Jared, you said, I think really early in the conversation around the importance of transparency, especially around sustainability. So I wonder if you could just share a little bit about how technology actually helps bring this transparency to us as we're looking to the impacts that we can have on sustainability.
I think this is, again, a multifolded answer here to a complex question. So I think transparency comes in multiple ways, right? So number one, of course, it gives the internal organization a better picture of what's really happening within their supply chain, and not just their top 20% suppliers, right? So gone is the 80-20 rule in this new world. It is insufficient. We need to monitor that entire supply base, at least at some level. And so this brings already a huge amount of transparency into an organization's supply chain. The other aspect that this does, I think, is allows, again, given the particular platform or technology choice, it allows suppliers to also be more transparent. So certain platforms out there give the ability for suppliers to not only have their profile on the platform, but also use it as a digital marketing tool, right? They get a nice score all around. They're good in environment, they're good in social, they're good in governance, and they want to advertise this, right? Link this to their homepage and say, look at how sustainable we are. We are doing what we say we're going to do. We're not just talking about it. So this is another aspect and one of those win-win scenarios for both customers and suppliers in this aspect. And the last part here, I think, is by taking the approach of standardization of questionnaires, right? So there's not customer-specific questions, basing these on the regulations, the changing regulations, and allowing suppliers to respond to a particular topic one time and then share this multiple times. It's lowering the burden on suppliers. It's increasing response rates. And again, it's opening up that transparency.
Yeah, we saw that from a third-party risk management perspective as well. Back when third-party risk management was becoming in focus for procurement teams, you'd have these huge, big questionnaires and surveys that would be hundreds of questions, and everyone would be asking different questions. And the standardization of those really makes it a lot easier for, companies of all sizes, but certainly smaller companies too, to be able to start to comply with and copy and paste essentially, and it just makes it a lot easier, the burden a lot less on those providers. Now, in terms of a business case, what are some of the kind of key areas that you would suggest that procurement teams are looking to bring technology into the way that they manage ESG? What are the key kind of areas of business case that you see?
I think it's very simple, right? It's a do we hire more human beings to do this? Yeah. And are we confident that these human beings are going to be on top of every changing regulation, every changing standard around the globe? And the ability to not only be on top of it, but execute it into a meaningful way that is not cumbersome for suppliers, that allows us to get a large response from our supply base. So this is, do we want humans to do this, or do we want to hire a technology provider to do this on our behalf and worry about this constantly changing environment, worry about the new reporting standards that are becoming important, et cetera? It's a lot to do internally, I think. Certainly there are IT organizations out there that are fully capable of this, but then you're taking away from other imperatives as well.
Yeah, and it brings scalability, doesn't it? It talks to what you said about the 20% is no longer acceptable just to understand the 20%. You need to understand that long tail, and you can't do that with humans. That's been proven 100%. Across all the different elements of procurement in the past. Now, we got a couple of minutes left, so I guess this is going to be a little bit of a quick fire, last couple of questions to wrap things up. Alex, I'm going to ask you first. We like to leave with a little bit of advice for anybody who's listening. So a quick point of advice, Alex, for procurement and supply chain teams looking to approach the C-suite about ESG? So taking that bottom-up approach.
Well, I mean, I think the first one's pretty obvious. You need to make the case for ESG from a regulatory perspective. No company can afford to ignore that. The expectations of investors, of customers, other stakeholders, they're just constantly growing. So this is something that won't go away. And then, more importantly, I think companies should try to really see ESG through the lens of opportunity, because if companies have outstanding sustainability credentials, or they really invest in ESG in a meaningful manner, then it allows them to differentiate themselves from their competitors. It allows them to optimize efficiency, achieve cost savings when we look at energy, for instance, or emissions, and related carbon pricing schemes that are popping up everywhere. Companies can tap into new markets and customer segments, and also boost innovation. So there's really so many benefits of focusing on ESG that really should not be ignored.
And Jared, I'm going to ask you the last question. I'm just actually going to come to a comment that Swapnil made in the comments, saying that his organization are working with our sustainability team to organize webinars with our SME vendors to skill them on ESG areas. I think that's a really important thing I wanted to bring out in terms of the responsibility we have to help educate the smaller businesses on what we're thinking about as an organization, but how to go about working with us. So I did want to just pull that out. Jared, the last question for you from a kind of a piece of take action advice. We talked right at the very beginning about thinking about 2024. What plans should we be putting in place to be ready for the new year in January, especially if we, as an organization, haven't really done so much formally to date?
I think the first thing you need to do is start kicking tires right now. 2024 is upon us. This year's flown by. I can guarantee these last 3 months are going to fly by as well. And if you're not getting started towards the end of this year, beginning of next year, you're going to miss the boat, right? It's not necessarily a long, arduous process, but depending on the size of the supply base, it can be, right? And getting the level of data into the system takes preparation. Getting the responses takes time. Figuring out what we would do with the responses, right? We've got some poor performing suppliers. Now we need to take action on them, right? And all of these things flow into the report. So the faster we start now, the more prepared we're going to be when it comes to actually hitting that button to generate the report.
Yeah, you don't want your CEO coming asking for data that you don't have, and it's going to take you 3 months or 6 months to be able to get hold of.
Exactly. And especially if it's not a top-down driven thing, you got to go get that budget as well, right?
Yeah. Well, I know it's time to wrap up. I want to thank everybody for joining us and listening into the conversation today. Jared and Alex, I want to thank you for sharing your expertise, your experiences with our art of procurement audience and community on what is obviously a very important topic and will continue to be so for procurement. If this episode struck a chord with you, please do send it to somebody. We grow here at Art of Procurement through word of mouth, and that would be really appreciated. You can also support us by giving us a thumbs up, a star rating, or a review wherever you listen to your podcasts. Since 2015, we've built the world's largest free resource for procurement professionals looking to elevate their impact. Our resources span podcasts like this, videos, blog posts, papers, and events. To join us on the inside and to ensure you never miss an episode, a webinar, an event, or a post, please do subscribe to our weekly newsletter, This Week in Procurement. You can do that at artofprocurement.com/subscribe. That's artofprocurement.com/subscribe. Thank you for joining us today, and I look forward to seeing you again soon.